Hello, my motor enthusiasts. Let me take you straight to the recently concluded 2024 Bahrain Grand Prix. The top three finishers were Max Verstappen, Sergio Pérez, and Carlos Sainz. Verstappen, the race winner, was delighted with the car's performance and their pace, despite a defensive start. Second placer Perez called the race tricky with tire management issues, yet remained confident for the upcoming Saudi Arabia race. Finishing third, Sainz overcame a less-than-ideal start and an aggressive drive strategy to make it to the podium. Both Verstappen and Perez, while satisfied, acknowledged areas of improvement for future races. Interesting battles on track, DRS activation post-lap 1, and tire management were key talking points of the post-race press conference. Now let's delve into the details, shall we? Hello there, you're back with your well-informed host, Enzo.
Hello everyone. William is here too, ready to delve into the nitty-gritty of Formula One.
Indeed, and we're here every day, bringing you hot-off-the-press insights on F1 Motor Fever podcast. Show some love, subscribe to our channel, and don't forget to hit that notification bell. Now, let's put the pedal to the metal. So let's dive deeper into this exhilarating race. Max Verstappen had a phenomenal day on the circuit. This marks his 54th Grand Prix victory, a clean sweep leading every lap and clocking the fastest one by a considerable margin.
Actually, it's Verstappen's 55th Grand Prix victory. Quite a feat, isn't it?
Oh yes, you're absolutely right. My apologies for the oversight. 55 Grand Prix victories indeed, an exceptional achievement for Verstappen. And moving on, Sergio Pérez, despite starting fifth on the grid, managed a commendable second-place finish.
Indeed, he mentioned that it was probably the best they could have achieved. The tyre management seemed to be quite a challenge during the race.
Now let's talk about our third-place finisher, Carlos Sainz. Despite an unideal start, he managed his tires well and exhibited a good pace. He overtook a couple of cars, ending up on the podium and even keeping up with a Red Bull at the end. Quite a pleasant surprise, wouldn't you say, William?
Absolutely, Enzo. Carlos Sainz really proved his mettle in the race. He was truly feisty out there, wanting that podium finish. But I'm curious, how does tyre management play such a crucial role in this context?
Great question, William. Tyre management is a complex and integral part of F1 racing. It's not just about the speed of the car, but how well the tires can sustain that speed without losing performance. For instance, Sainz mentions feeling more comfortable with the hard compound as it tends to overheat less and degrade slower. However, this type of tire can be tricky with warm-up and front locking.
Could you elaborate a bit on the term front locking, Enzo?
Of course, William. Front locking refers to a situation when the front tires of an F1 car lose traction during heavy braking, causing them to skid. This usually happens when drivers brake heavily into a corner, causing the tire to stop rotating while the car is still in motion. You'll often see a puff of smoke in these situations. That's a telltale sign of tire lockup. It's a situation that drivers aim to avoid, as it can lead to tire damage and compromised cornering speed.
I see. That certainly adds another layer of complexity to the race.
Reflecting on what Max Verstappen said about the wind intensity making a difference, it reminds me of a time when I covered a race in Melbourne. Even a slight gust of wind there can change a driver's strategy drastically.
Comparing your experience covering races with the actual experience of an F1 driver, are we now?
Now don't scoff. Remember, we're all part of the same ecosystem. While I may not be in the driver's seat, experiencing and understanding these conditions firsthand provides valuable insight for someone like me, who needs to interpret these events for our listeners.
I see your point, and I apologize. Understanding the conditions does bring a unique perspective to our discussion.
Moving on, Max Verstappen points out the stark differences between tracks, particularly in terms of layout and tarmac. He anticipates that a less degrading tarmac could aid other teams besides his own. It's worth noting that every track has its own unique characteristics and challenges, which can level the playing field and allow for some surprises, wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. The difference in track conditions fundamentally affects the strategies that the teams adopt. Now about this degradation, could you explain a bit more about what it means in this context?
Sure, tire degradation is simply the wearing out of the rubber on the tires. It's a critical aspect in Formula One and affects the performance of the tires. A tire that degrades less stays in its optimal performance range longer. Hence, lesser degeneration would be favorable for all teams.
That makes sense, thanks for explaining. Now let's talk about Sergio Checo Perez. He seems extremely satisfied with his progress in the race, doesn't he?
Indeed, despite starting from 5th position, Perez was able to make significant headway. He mentioned having to handle several on-track battles, which altered his strategy, and he also had to deal with issues like increased sliding and heavy traffic. However, he seemed quite content with the overall team result.
And his views on the upcoming race in Jeddah.
Perez seems to be looking forward to the race in Jeddah, given his victory there last year. He also expressed confidence in the car's capabilities with the high-speed content of the track. However, he acknowledged the upcoming challenge, as Jeddah's conditions will be significantly different. Continuing with our discussion, Carlos Sainz highlights the importance of starting the season on a high note. He's particularly excited about the attacking races and not having to constantly watch his mirrors or be overly cautious with the tires.
Wait a second. Are you implying that defensive racing isn't as impressive as aggressive racing?
Not at all, but having the capacity for both defensive and offensive strategies adds versatility, don't you think?
Absolutely not. Defensive driving can be just as strategic and challenging as offensive. It's all about the skill of the driver, not just about making overtakes.
While I agree that both require skill, let's not undermine the thrill of an overtaking maneuver, the sheer audacity it takes.
Audacity? This isn't a game, it's a sport. It's about technique and precision, not just about being audacious.
Seems like we're not going to agree on this. Let's take a short break. I need to fetch a glass of water to cool off.
Sure, go ahead. Well, listeners, I'm not sure what's happening here. I mean, sometimes it feels like Enzo sees this sport as some sort of action movie. It's all about the thrill and audacity for him. But it's not always about being aggressive on the track. Apologies for the little disagreement.
I'm back. Thank you for waiting. Shall we continue? I believe we were discussing Carlos Sainz's approach to the race. All right, back to Carlos Sainz. He discussed his overtaking strategy, ensuring he doesn't cost Charles Leclerc any time. He also expressed his thoughts on the final stint, comparing the tire conditions between Red Bull and his own team.
That's right. He also mentions the challenge of being in that 2 to 3 second margin, where the dirty air from the car in front affects performance, without gaining the advantage of the DRS and slipstream.
True, but he didn't seem too surprised by Red Bull's pace in the race, did he?
No, not at all. He mentioned that he knew they had a 3 to 4 tenth advantage and that beating the Red Bulls would be a tough task.
I've got a mate who's a diehard Red Bull fan. He'd be chuffed to hear about this. On another note, Sainz seems content with keeping up with one Red Bull and having the possibility to fight. It's a positive start for him. What do you think?
Absolutely. Starting the season strong is key. It sets the tone for the remaining races and gives a much-needed morale boost to the team. It will be interesting to see how the rest of the season pans out.
Let's dive back into the discussion. Carlos elaborates on being back in an aggressive mode, a stark contrast to the defensive strategies he had to employ last season. He seems relieved to be able to showcase his overtaking and attacking prowess once again.
Indeed, it seems like a marked change from last year's strategy. Carlos implies that last year's car made it nearly impossible to perform aggressive maneuvers due to overheating tires and the detrimental effects of dirty air.
Exactly. This year he feels confident about being able to carry out more attacking races, although he does caution that it doesn't mean they'll be able to do it every race.
Yes, he even mentions that their strong suits lie in qualifying, which might place them ahead in the starting grid, but not necessarily in the race itself.
Moving on to Max Verstappen, he appears to think that the Red Bull car's strength lies more in race performance rather than in one-lap performance. Do you reckon this could be a potential disadvantage for the team in future races?
It's hard to say at this point. While one-lap performance is vital for pole positions, race performance can dictate the final outcome. It depends on how the team balances these two aspects throughout the season.
Moving forward, Max Verstappen explains that the Red Bull car, while not necessarily the best in one-lap performance, excels in races for most tracks. He also believes that today's wind conditions have favored them more compared to the last 2 days.
That's interesting. Do you think that this reliance on weather conditions could prove tricky for Red Bull during the season?
Possibly. It's all part of racing, isn't it? Verstappen doesn't seem too concerned about it for now. He's mainly focusing on improving from race to race. A prudent strategy, I'd say.
Absolutely. I wonder, do you think Max feels more pressure this season?
I think that's a question for Max himself, not me. Anyway, Verstappen also comments on the tire strategy, stating that the decision to choose the soft tire over the hard one was clear-cut, considering the learnings from testing and practice.
Right, my apologies. I didn't mean to overstep.
No worries at all, mate. Let's focus on the discussion at hand. Sergio Pérez, too, agrees that the hard tire isn't performing as well as with other teams, and they seem to manage the soft tire better. It's quite insightful, don't you think?
Yes, indeed. It's an interesting perspective on their strategy. He seems quite confident about their performance on the soft tire.
Agreed. Confidence is key, especially when you're racing neck and neck with the best in the world. Let's see how the rest of the season unfolds. Carlos sheds some light on the tire degradation issue, stating that his teammate Charles experienced earlier tire wear, which led to Carlos staying out on track for a few more laps. He feels that it didn't impact his race negatively, as he could overtake Charles and George quite swiftly.
That's intriguing. Carlos seems to suggest that sometimes taking a bit of a risk can pay off in the race. It reminds me of what my uncle used to say, fortune favors the bold.
Hey, a wise man, your uncle. The drivers also share their thoughts on the impact of the drag reduction system, or DRS, being activated from lap 1. Sergio Pérez thinks it definitely changes the dynamics of the race, especially when in a closely contested fight.
That's right. Perez also points out how the early activation of DRS can be a disadvantage, especially for the car ahead that has to use more of its tyres. He predicts this might change the face of racing in circuits like Baku or Jeddah.
Carlos agrees, suggesting that the sensitivity of the tyres to pushing adds another layer of strategy to the race. He believes that it's a fine line between pushing to get into DRS range and saving tyres due to how sensitive they are in the initial laps.
Carlos's approach seems to have paid off, as he mentions overtaking without a problem after managing his tyres instead of getting into a DRS battle. It's a testament to the old saying, slow and steady wins the race. My mum was fond of that one.
Haha, it seems like racing wisdom runs in your family. Let's see how this new DRS rule impacts the strategy and outcome of future races. Picking up where we left off, both Carlos and Max anticipate a challenging season with 24 races. They also reflect on the complexities of knowing when to push or save tires, especially with the early activation of the drag reduction system.
If I may ask, why do they call it the drag reduction system and not just the speed booster or something like that?
Hey, listeners, please bear with us. I believe our dear friend here might be having a childlike moment. Are we back in primary school, mate?
Hey, not all of us are die-hard Formula One fans. Some listeners might be new to the sport. It's an honest question.
Fair point, but I reckon if anyone's tuning in to F1 Motor Fever podcast, they likely have at least a basic understanding of the sport. Otherwise, we might risk sounding too simplistic and lose our core audience.
It's always good to cater to a broad audience, right? There might be someone just starting their F1 journey who finds it useful.
True, but let's not go overboard and risk losing our seasoned listeners. They might switch channels.
Or they could find joy in revisiting the basics. You never know.
Hey, agree to disagree then. Let's get back to the topic at hand. Max feels today's race was special because everything just went perfectly, from the balance of the car to his personal feeling in the car.
That's great to hear. It's always lovely when things just click into place.
Let's take a moment to summarize. We've covered a lot today, especially for those who have just joined us. We started by discussing Carlos Sainz's tire strategy and how it played out in the race. We then moved on to the early activation of the drag reduction system and its impact on the dynamics of racing, specifically in terms of tire management.
It's been quite enlightening to hear the drivers' thoughts on these matters. Really gives you a sense of the strategy and the split-second decisions that go into a race.
Couldn't agree more. From there, we delved into the drivers' predictions for the upcoming season, consisting of an unprecedented 24 races. Drivers will face the challenge of balancing tire preservation and pushing for speed within the new rule settings.
Absolutely. With the new DRS rules and the increased season length, it's going to be quite the task for the teams. I'm looking forward to seeing how they handle it.
Lastly, we peeled back the curtain on what makes a race special for Max Verstappen. Apparently, the stars aligned today with a favorable balance in the car and Max's personal comfort level.
It indeed sounds like a fine day at the races for him. These insights just make you appreciate the sport even more.
And that, dear listeners, brings us up to speed. Now, what are your thoughts on the race?
Mate, it's been top drawer. A true testament to the brilliance of Formula One. There's nothing quite like it.
Spot on. It's been a roller coaster of a day, filled with strategic gambles and revelations. Now, shall we get back to it?
Absolutely, let's...
Building on Carlos's comments about the overheating of front brakes, it reminds me of the time I got a chance to be in the paddock during a test session. It was fascinating to see the minute adjustments they made to manage the brake cooling.
A big shot in the paddock, were you? Haha, next you'll tell us you were in the pit crew changing tires.
Oh, come on, mate. I may not have the hands-on experience, but it was quite an enlightening venture. You know, being close to the action gives you a different perspective.
Apologies, mate. Didn't mean to take the mickey out of you. It must have been a brilliant experience indeed.
No harm done. On a side note, it's interesting to hear Carlos touch on how the heat from other cars affects brake cooling. He mentioned changing his line on the straights to cool the brakes. It's not just about speed, it's also about managing the car's health.
Yeah, very true. It's not all pedal to the metal. There's a lot of strategy involved.
Absolutely. And speaking of strategies, Max indicates that different tracks might change the dynamics of the race. It's not as simple as who runs the fastest lap. He mentions specifically street circuits. Now that's a whole different ballgame.
Oh, it certainly is. Street circuits bring their own challenges. It'll be intriguing to see how the teams navigate those.
Max's comment about the new car concept working flawlessly is an interesting point. He mentions that some teams couldn't make different car concepts work, which just emphasizes how crucial the development stage is for the season.
Absolutely. A flawless car concept can make or break a season. But the key is not just having a good concept, it's making it work consistently on the track.
True. Max also mentions the car feels similar to last year's model, but with some minor improvements. And you know, I believe that's where the magic happens, in those tiny incremental improvements.
Couldn't agree more. It's those little tweaks and enhancements that can make all the difference in the world of Formula One.
It's interesting to hear Sergio's thoughts as well. He's in agreement with Max about the risk of changing the concept, but it seems to be paying off. He mentioned that the team is still learning about their new car, which could suggest further improvements down the line.
Yes, it sounds like they're really honing their understanding of the car's capabilities. It'll be interesting to see how they develop from here.
Lastly, we have Carlos, who hopes to pose a real challenge to Max and Checo. He seems rather optimistic about the car's aero platform and the downforce levels, but he also admits they need to keep up with adding downforce or they risk falling behind.
That's always the challenge, isn't it? Keeping up with the pace of development. It's not just about having a good car at the start of the season, it's about continually improving it as the season progresses. Let's see how things unfold in the upcoming races.
William, have you had a chance to see what the fans are saying about the Bahrain Grand Prix on the internet?
Ah yes, A user named Frank Marvin kicked off a thread saying, quote, 2024 Bahrain Grand Prix race discussion, unquote. It seems like a lively discussion ensued around the race.
Oh, do share some of the more colorful remarks.
Right, listen to this. A user named Michael Avery points out, quote, Verstappen just needs some pressure put on him. If Leclerc hadn't had issues, I think he could have kept a closer pace. Perez still isn't quite as comfortable in the car as Verstappen, so his pace will likely remain slightly slower when behind, unquote.
Ah, classic armchair experts. What else?
There seems to be a lot of support for Carlos Sainz. A user named Edward Paterson enthusiastically said, quote, Max is my guy, but I was rooting hard for Carlos, unquote. And another user, Sam Warren, chimed in with, quote, I'm all for Carlos this season, unquote.
There's certainly a lot of love for Sainz. Do we have more?
Yes, many more. A user named Alpha White comments, quote, they need to change the rules for 2025. The spending cap is really hurting the sport. The lower place a team, the more money they can spend to catch up, unquote.
Interesting perspective. Any more notable comments?
Well, a user named Del Piero45 seems quite disappointed. Quote, shout out the FIA for completely ruining the sport after one of the greatest seasons of all time in 2021, unquote.
Well, everyone is entitled to their opinion. But remember, folks, it's all part of the game. You win some, you lose some. It's never a straight road in the world of Formula One. Thank you all for tuning in to F1 Motor Fever podcast today. We've had a fantastic time discussing the ins and outs of the recent race, and it's been magnificent to have you all here alongside us. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell so you stay up to date with all our episodes. Trust me, it makes a world of difference.
And honestly, if you enjoyed our chatter today, don't keep it to yourself. Share our channel with your buddies, your family, your Formula One fan club, or even your unsuspecting neighbors. Spread the word on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or during your next Zoom meeting. If our podcast made your day a bit brighter, let us know in the comments below.
Indeed, it's always lovely to hear from you lot. We're excited for more heated discussions and insightful analyses in our upcoming episodes. So make sure you stick around. Remember, we're on air every day.
That's right, we're like your daily dose of caffeine, but for the racing world. And speaking of exciting things, we've got plenty of thrilling content coming up. But no spoilers, you'll just have to stay tuned to find out.
Once again, thank you for joining us today on F1 Motor Fever podcast. We're looking forward to having you with us next time. Until then, pedal to the metal, keep your gaze on the road. Our channel's content is pure gold.